Hello everybody. If you're watching this, you've made it to the last week of U.S. government this summer. Congratulations. Only 1 week to go. This week we'll be covering topics that we usually don't cover in the same unit, but because of 5 weeks, they're scrunched together. And that's the media and political parties and interests. And so like I've done with the other 4 units, let me walk you through some of the major things that you'll be looking at as you work your way through this week. First of all, we're going to be talking about the media. One of the things that you may have noted in recent years, or maybe not, because younger Americans typically don't read the newspaper, is that newspapers are dying. They were dying before the most recent recession, but the recession has hurt newspapers a lot. One of the questions we have, and it's a more general question really about the media, is should we really care? And I think the easy answer is that yes, that we should care about the death of the newspaper because the news media plays an important role in American democracy. Because we don't learn about things that aren't in the news. The media serves as a gatekeeper. It also provides information for us as a scorekeeper, who's winning and losing. It helps to explain things to us. And finally, it helps to keep track of government and what they're doing. It serves as a watchdog. Another point is that trust in the media is down. So even though it continues to serve these functions, it may not do it as well as it used to do. Another major issue that I hope you'll look at is the way that news has become increasingly nationalized. Not only in terms of newspapers, but in terms of the electronic media as well. That doesn't mean that there isn't a diversity of opinion out there, because in fact there is. You just have to look in more specific and sort of increasingly complicated places to find that diversity. Another important issue is that of bias. Is the media biased? In fact, we hear often that it is. And when we hear talk about media bias, we often talk about it in the context of political bias. In fact, there is some political bias in the media. And in fact, some people have figured out how to make money based on that media bias. But it's also important to note that the more important bias comes from the nature of these businesses. Media businesses, whether they're electronic media like television or newspapers, are profit-driven enterprises. And their news coverage tends to emphasize the kinds of things that are easy to cover and that will make us pay attention in quick and often superficial kinds of ways. It's not that the fire and the flood aren't important, it's that they're not the only things that are important, and the news coverage tends to focus on these superficially, visually appealing, dramatic, easy stories to tell. Another bias is the negative bias that we see in the news media. This negative bias manifests itself in seeing political candidates, elected officials, and others generally portrayed in a negative light. And so in that sense, what we really have are some significant structural biases that exist in the news media. Also want to tap in briefly to look at regulation. The other two the other two major topics that we'll be looking at are political parties, and you see here a definition that comes from the text. What's most important here is that political parties organize politics. We have a two-party system in the United States, and as you'll see in reading the text, we can find distinct party eras where we've seen regular change between the major parties and what they stand for at 30 or 40-year intervals throughout American history. Why do we have two parties? Well, there are a variety of reasons why we have them, and they're listed here. The way we carry out our elections, the lack of fundamental disputes, laws that encourage it, and now tradition. And the text explores these. We can also think about political parties in a variety of ways. First of all, we can think about parties in the electorate. You and I as voters think about parties, and parties turns out very important for us in terms of voting. There are also organizations that run candidates for elected office and help to organize the elections themselves. And finally, elected officials in government are organized along political party lines. as we saw when we looked at Congress and its leadership, for example, and the ways that that leadership interacts with presidents of the United States. Finally, in terms of political parties, the textbook talks a little bit about current political party coalitions. The last topic of discussion is interest groups. And when we think about interest groups, we're really thinking about factions in the way that James Madison talked about them early in the semester in Federalist 10. One of the important issues in dealing with factions is why we would join an interest group, and the text talks about some of the reasons why we might in fact join interest groups. I'm sorry it's out of order, but I'm not going back. Here's a definition of interest groups, and what I'd encourage you to look at in terms of this definition is to contrast it with the definition of political parties that the textbook presented a little earlier. In terms of thinking about interest groups in the modern era, one important point is that there are many more groups than there used to be. And secondly, that these groups take on a much broader range of interests than was once the case. This has been especially true in the last 30 to 40 years. What interests do they represent? Here you get an example: economic, equal opportunity interests, public interests, and government and institutions. And the text talks about the growth of these varying kinds of interests. The text also talks about the people who join interest groups. And it's important to think about this, especially in light of thinking about who votes in elections as well. The text also talks about the strategies that interest groups use: lobbying, gaining access, using the courts, trying to shape public opinion, and electoral politics. The final question in terms of interest groups really asks, was Madison right? Does our government structure interests, factions, in such a way to create a positive good? Political scientists who looked at this question in the 1950s found, in fact, that this could be the case. What the political scientists who called themselves pluralists found were that there were many groups, and these groups were easy to form, and they represented lots of diverse interests. Some questioned this analysis, arguing, as E. Schatznyder did, the choir sings with an upper-class bias, that certain kinds of interests were much more likely to be represented. So one critique is, yes, lots of groups, but they tend to represent the same kinds of elite interests. A second criticism comes from the idea of hyperpluralism, the idea that there are in fact so many groups that it clogs up the system and makes it impossible for virtually anything to get done. Finally, assignments for the week. In addition to your quiz and your online discussion about interest groups and lobbying, you have a choice in an assignment between looking at political party platforms and understanding front pages of newspapers. And of course, you have your final op-ed piece due on the 2nd as well. Good luck. Hope you've had a good semester.